let's just remember some of the things that have been said about this issue. Here from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in October of 2021. She said, quote, any member of Congress who helped plot a terrorist attack on our nation's capital must be expelled. This was a terror attack, 138 injured, almost 10 dead. Those responsible remain a danger to our democracy, our country, and our human life in the vicinity of our capital and beyond. I love that sentence. Those responsible remain a danger to our democracy, our country, and human life in the vicinity of our capital and beyond. Now, everybody was very confused. Like, what do you mean almost 10 people died on January 6th? First of all, why would you use that formulation? Why not say the number of people who died? Why would you say almost 10? What does that mean? Like 6, 8, 9, 7? What does that mean? But as I said, there were only 4 people who died on January 6th. She's apparently counting some of the protesters who died. She says 5 protesters died on January 6th. Or I believe she said 4 or 5. She's counting police officers, including, as you might recall, Brian Sicknick, who we were told had his head bashed in by a fire extinguisher and died at the Capitol. And in fact, it turned out he died of natural causes, as the autopsy said. She's counting police officers who committed suicide days or weeks after January 6th. It would, of course, be embarrassing if you tried to call it a coup or an insurrection and the only people who died on January 6th, which was true, were the people who were actually there protesting for Donald Trump, one of whom was shot, 2 of whom died of a heart attack, and 1 of whom died of a drug overdose. These were not people who were part of a well-trained militia, to put that mildly. But there was a need to exaggerate it intensely from the beginning, and so it couldn't just be that 4 Trump supporters died. You had to have other people dying as well, and so they just lied about it constantly. Here, just to give you a reminder of how these lies proliferated from the very beginning about January 6th, all with the intention, while these emotions were still raw, to make it seem as though there was some kind of mass murder spree on the part of Trump supporters at the Capitol. Listen to what the people who insist they're the only ones who combat disinformation ended up saying.
Qualified it.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the hours-long attack.
They beat a Capitol police officer to death with a fire extinguisher.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the fight.
He died at the age of 42 after he was bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher.
All with such a melodramatic tone. He was beaten. Just think about this. They went on television and they said that Brian Sicknick was murdered by Capitol Hill protesters because he was beaten to death. His head was bludgeoned by a fire extinguisher by protesters. A complete and utter fabrication. And you just see one network after the next, as usual, saying it in unison. Here from NBC News, 3.5 months later, reported the truth because they had to, because the medical examiner pronounced it. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died of natural causes after the riot. A medical examiner says an autopsy revealed that Sicknick, who died hours after the Capitol riot, suffered 2 strokes at the base of the brain stem caused by a blood clot. And then here from Newsweek in August, quote, 4 Capitol Hill police officers have died by suicide since the January 6th insurrection. And they decided they're going to count 4 suicides by police officers for who knows what reason. I mean, is it really reasonable if a police officer kills themselves to blame their participation in a 3-hour riot? If that's not something they can withstand, what are they doing as police officers? And could you imagine any other instance where that framework would be used? If a Black Lives Matter protest happened and it turned into a riot and it was violent, which often happened, and there ended up being clashes between the protesters and the police officers, which happened, and then a month later or a month and a half later, a police officer involved in that killed themselves, would anybody say, oh, this was a violent victim of the Black Lives Matter mob who murdered this police officer because they killed themselves after being involved in a clash? Of course not. This is a deliberate attempt to take this 3-hour riot, wildly exaggerate it with the dual purposes of trying to demonize Donald Trump and his movement, obviously, but also to justify domestic crackdowns by the U.S. security state. That's what they always do. That's what they did after 9/11. It's what they've done in countless instances where they claim there's a domestic threat. That's the playbook. And that was a major part of why this was exaggerated. I don't mean to keep citing AOC, but she was really at the top of her game when it came to drama queen hysteria, even though she was nowhere near the actual riot. She wasn't even in the building. Here she is on CNN in a very contemplative way, really feeling like she got a second lease on life, just escaping by the most incredible amount of luck. Some spirit must have really been protecting her. It was a miracle that she made it out alive. And here she is talking about what became very close to happening, according to her, on January 6th.
I didn't think that I was just going to be killed. I thought other things were going to happen to me as well.
So what sounds like what you're telling me right now is that you didn't only think that you were going to die, you thought you were going to be raped.
Yeah. I thought I was.
And that you now understand, having thought about it, is because of your experience.
Yeah, I think so.
Look at that expression by Dana Bash there at the end. She's like, this is really serious. This is very grave. AOC not only thought she was going to die, she thought she was going to be raped, even though she was nowhere near anything that was happening. That all was in her mind. And then you might remember, hours after the riot was subdued, she went on to Twitter and she put her notorious tweet that said, quote, I'm okay. And then about 3 weeks later, there was a controversy because there were various stocks that were skyrocketing that Reddit speculators had purposely caused to skyrocket in order to impose a lot of financial pain on short sellers who had bet on the collapse of those stocks, and instead they sent those stocks like GameStore and others to a very high level. And because it was harming very rich people, some of the apps that people are using to trade froze the selling and buying of that stock in order to protect those short sellers. And Ted Cruz said, AOC came out and said, this seems very improper. We should investigate. And Ted Cruz said, you know what? I agree with AOC here. We should join together and investigate it. And she responded by saying, sorry, but you tried to have me murdered 3 weeks ago. I'll work with Republicans, but not ones who have tried to have me killed. This was the insanity. It was as bad as Russiagate, if not worse. Everything that was being said about it. But the issue is that it was really hard to try and discern whether or not these people actually believed what they were saying, despite how facially preposterous it was, or if they were saying it for effect, for a purpose, in order to manipulate the public, to be and put into a state of fear-mongering. Usually it's a very complex mix of those two ignoble motives. But in this case, it's no longer a question. It's so incredibly clear that none of them meant anything that they were saying, because if they did, they wouldn't be unanimous in standing by and allowing Adolf Hitler to return to power. And yet that's exactly what they're doing. They were urged today by Joe Biden in his op-ed, in the op-ed written by who knows who, the same people who have been running the government in his name, that was published yesterday. Quote, Joe Biden, what Americans should remember about January 6th. Quote, 4 years ago, our democracy was put to the test and we prevailed. Quote, on this January 6th, order will be called. Clerks, staff, and members of Congress will gather to certify the results of a free and fair presidential election and ensure a peaceful transfer of power. Capitol Police will stand guard over the citadel of our democracy. The citadel of our democracy. The Vice President of the United States, faithful to her duty under our Constitution, will preside over the certification of our opponent's victory in the November election. For much of our history, this proceeding was treated as pro forma, a routine act, but after what we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, we know we can never again take it for granted. Violent insurrectionists attacked the Capitol, threatened the lives of elected officials, and assaulted brave law enforcement officers. We should be proud that our democracy withstood this attack, and we should be glad we will not see such a shameful attack again this year. But we should not forget. We must remember the wisdom of the adage that any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it. We cannot accept a repeat of what occurred 4 years ago. An unrelenting effort has been underway to rewrite, even erase the history of that day, to tell us we didn't see what we all saw with our own eyes, to dismiss concerns about it as some kind of partisan obsession, to explain it away as a protest that just got out of hand. That's exactly what it was, a protest that just got out of hand. In time, there will be Americans who didn't witness the January 6th riot firsthand, but will learn about it from footage and testimony of that day, from what is written in the history books, and from the truth we pass on to our children. We cannot allow the truth be lost. Allow the truth to be lost. Thousands of rioters crossed the National Mall and climbed the Capitol walls, smashing windows and kicking down doors just blocks away. A bomb was found near the location of the incoming vice president, threatening her life. Law enforcement officials were beaten, dragged, knocked unconscious, and stomped upon. Some police officers ultimately died as a result. None of that is true. I could basically dissect it sentence for sentence. But you see the rhetorical effort to depict it as belonging in the pantheon of major moral evils in the United States, similar to what Sonny Huston did. Whoever wrote the article for Biden had enough sense to be sufficiently subtle not to explicitly compare it to the Holocaust and slavery, but that's the ethos of the language being invoked. This is something that is going to be in our history books. We can't allow revisionism. People who didn't live through this heinous event are going to have to learn about it. But again, if Joe Biden or anybody writing on his behalf actually believes any of this, why aren't they taking the action commensurate with that belief? Probably remember about a month ago, Joe Biden invited the insurrectionist Nazi to the White House and shook his hand and said, whatever you need, we will be happy to give you. None of this is the behavior of people who believe in any of the things that they're saying. From the New York Times today, January 6th, that solemn day that will go down in American history forever. Congress certifies Trump's victory in ritual disrupted by violence in 2021. Quote, Vice President Kamala Harris announced Donald J. Trump's win in a quick session without drama, a stark contrast from 4 years ago. Why? If the Trump supporters were willing to protest on the streets because they thought they had the election stolen, why wouldn't Democrats be doing more to disrupt the natural order of business if they think that a Nazi, white supremacist fascist is returning to power? Obviously, the New York Times needed to do a retrospective to remind everybody of it. The New York Times today, the January 6th rioters 4 years later. And then here from NBC News, Congress certifies Trump's 2024 election win 4 years after he inspired a riot. You see the attempt, not just to report on what happened, but the constant attempt to massage and manipulate the headline. CNN, this was, it says, it's today. 4 years after his supporters invaded the U.S. Capitol, Trump is more powerful than ever. You know, it's really, the thing that amazes me, and I actually was on Megyn Kelly's show earlier today, for those of you who haven't seen that or want to watch it, and we touched on this a little bit. The strategy of the Democratic Party and its allies in media and the establishment wing of the Republican Party that was devoted to Donald Trump's defeat was very clear. It was to say, don't care about policy or ideology or any of the dissatisfactions that you have in your life. There's something bigger at stake. It's January 6th and our democracy and this person who wants to dismantle it. And that was what the whole tactic was about, with joining with Liz Cheney and parading her around and talking about the Republicans that were supporting Kamala Harris, which was to say, even these conservatives don't agree with us on anything. And that, by the way, was a falsehood as well. Even Liz Cheney said the reason we're supporting Kamala Harris isn't just because of January 6th, but because we agree more with her foreign policy than we do with the Trump-led GOP. But the idea was to depict this as being everybody's coming together of decency who believes in our country despite policy differences, because there's something much bigger at stake, a question of decency and whether democracy will prevail. And that tactic turned out to be a towering, abject failure. No one voted on that. No one cared. Nobody thought that Donald Trump was some grave existential threat to American democracy who wasn't already going to vote against him anyway. That's not the thing that Americans are waking up and worrying about. They've repeatedly said what they're worrying about in poll after poll after poll, and it's not that. And yet Democrats and the media, their media allies, had nothing else. They had clung to this narrative for so long. Just like in 2016, they clung to the narrative of Russiagate that nobody cared about. And even though they know that no one cares about it, even though they know it fell on deaf ears, they just cannot relinquish it. It's like an addiction. To just give it up would be to admit, like, oh, actually, this didn't really this was never really as important as we tried to pretend it was. Is there another example of, and I think even as a very long time, harsh, devoted, not just critic of, but someone who really harbors a lot of contempt for the corporate media, even I sometimes think, their lies and propaganda can't be that deliberate, can't be that systematic. Just look at how often they lie, how continuously and relentlessly they push false narratives that are only about their politicized agenda. And every time it gets exposed, every time it gets revealed, they continue to insist that they either got it right or they just move on as nothing happened. The same thing was true with claiming that anybody concerned about Joe Biden's cognitive decline was engaged in right-wing disinformation, only for that obviously to have been fully vindicated in every way. And yet over and over they were insisting angrily that anyone questioning Joe Biden's cognitive abilities was engaged in some sort of twisted propaganda. This is why faith and trust in the media has completely collapsed. You can just almost every night give a different example. But to try and equate January 6th as a coup and insurrection on par with 9/11 and Pearl Harbor or the Holocaust and slavery, to depict Donald Trump as a Nazi-like figure, only to then completely abandon it and not follow through on any of the steps you would absolutely embrace if you truly had that authentic conviction that that was true, is just going to erode all of this even further. None of their actions are commensurate with their stated beliefs, and that basically is another way of saying not just that somebody lied, but that they are very well aware that what they said was a lie. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.